Hello my friend, welcome in LightCode channel and welcome in a new tutorial. In this episode we will talk about validation. Validation is the most important aspect while designing an application. Validation validates the incoming data. Laravel framework provides several different approaches to validate your application incoming data. For starting work, I create the Laravel project. This Laravel project have many parts. I will illustrate all these parts one by one and step by step. And first of all, I create a controller. I named it a student controller. We share this controller. This controller have many functions I created before for saving time. One of them, this function all student. By this function, we will call the student view page, and the second function is data form, which by this method we can call data form view page. And the third function is store data, which by this function we can validate here and store the data in the database. After that, after creating the controller, we will create a three view page here in the resources views. Here, this view page, all student, this page, in fact, a table, we have a table which by this table we can display all data we store it in the database. And the second view page, view blade, the data form, by this page we can create a data form. By this data form we can receive the data from user and send the data to the database. And here in the data form, as you can see, this form, I create a class, and here the form, and by the form we have many input type text box for receiving the data from the user and send this data to the database by using this action, the URL store data. In the web, we have this store data here. By this store data, we can invoke a store data function we created before in the student controller. You can see here, store data. Let me show you. By this store data, we can validate the data, and after we validate the data, we can save this data in the database by using the create helper. Here in this part, a validation part. In this part, we can validate the data before we store it by this helper. Also, I created database in the PHP admin here in the admin. I create a new database. I termed it school, and in this school I create a table. I name it student. In this table have the many columns like here ID, first name, last name, and email and age. So also I say for you, I say here for showing any errors, we need to use this part of the controller from data here above this controller. When happen the error, we must display this error for the user by using this part of the code. This is the code here. If error happen, any error here from here, if any error happened, we will display this this error or this message by this using this part of the code. Also in the controller, student controller here, in the store data, when the data are stored successfully in the database, we will send this message by this key to the user and tell him or tell her the data is stored successfully in the database. So let me start for the, make the validation logic. Here must be create the validation logic. In the validation documentation, in the framework documentation, have many logic for validate data, but in this tutorial we will use just required logic for control the data is in the input or in the text box, which is we created in the form data. In this tutorial, I focused on how we can validate data and ignore all data about how we can create table or how we can decorate data form. So excuse me if I focused only on the only how we can validate it. For validating here we have 4 type of data here. So we need to validate this data before we store it in the database. So here in the validate part, we must say validate by using the request. Here, this request, here say request, still a request, and validate, and create array, close by semicolon, array, request, this, I copy this from here, Control C, and edit it here, Control V, this request. Into this array, we can add our logic for validated data. So I copy this first name, Control C, the first name, first data with power control, Control C here and Control V. And you can see in the documentation, laravel documentation here, how we can create, for example, title required. In this tutorial, we focus on the required logic, required taken. But in the laravel documentation, you can see more information about control and validate data like unique or max or main character, which user must be sent for our database. So I come back to the VS Code here and say like this by using this markup. Here I say and say required, and after that here colon, and the last name also must be controlled, last name, and equal and create, and for example required, and also we need to add email must be controlled and equal and required, this required, Control C, and required must be here, Control V. And after that we must control control the email age. So I say age and equal and required. By this snip of code, we validate all data before the data stored by this helper, create helper in the VS Code. So let me go to the data form and send the control if it work fine or not. So I go back to the here in this controller and added new, for example, this data form I created before. For saving time, I ignore the data how we can create this. So I send empty text box for the validation, and I will see if the validation control working fine or not. As you can see here, the Laravel framework created for us the error message. We can see here this message. This message tell us the first name. This need be required, must be full this text box and other text box here. This error message here, I can see you where is the error message snip code in the data form. You can see here in the data form by this snip of code. By this snip of code, we show to the user the data, the input or text box must be full by data, and the data will not store it before the requirement of the data doing by the users. So I come back to the, I go back to the Chrome, and here I say add some information and try to send this data to the database. So I send, for example, gene, for example, Saki. Socket and email socket, for example, @ gmail.com, and a, for example, 23 and 3, and send data. You can see here our project added this data to the database. After that, it show us for the data, and here we send for us this message. Where is this message? This message here in the store data. You can see in the controller, pseudo controller, in the store data here. We tell the store data when the data recorded successfully in the database, you must send this message by this key to the user and tell him and announce him that the data stored in the database successfully. So as you know, here we learn how we can how we can use the validation helper, which by the request created from the Laravel framework. Here, by using this validate helper, we can, by this markup of code, we can validate the data. We can add many more logic here. For example, if say max or main, for example, main or max data, I let's see here, and by this we can check if the number of the character which user must be entered into the text box on the input tools. I think enough for this tutorial. In this tutorial, we learn how we can create the validation logic for the control data and how we can store this data in the database by using this helper. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial, and I hope this is useful for you. For now, bye bye and God bless you.